River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Unlike the Prime Minister and ministers across, it actually gives me no pleasure to rise to speak on the matter at hand. The invocation of the Emergencies Act earlier this week, for the first time in Canadian history, is a significant moment, and it's not a moment to be pleased about. It's a solemn moment. It's a moment where we have to ask ourselves, how did we get to the situation we're here in the first place? And when we examine the evidence of how we got to this situation, I don't think there's much for this government to be proud of. Now, the Conservatives thoughtfully considered the justifications written in law and given by this government for the enacting of the Emergencies Act. This government has based their justification on one provision, that a public order emergency exists throughout Canada. This claim is not supported by the evidence. Yes, we have seen border blockades in at least 4 provinces, and we have seen a persistent and now declared illegal protest in Ottawa. Before the Emergencies Act was invoked, the blockades at the borders and across Canada were lifted, or were well into the process of being lifted. So the government trying to claim credit after the fact is completely absurd. The Emergencies Act is now being used solely for the purpose of addressing the situation in Ottawa, not throughout Canada as defined by the Act. Now, a key part of the threshold for enacting these measures is that existing laws and capabilities have proven insufficient for dealing with the problem. Madam Speaker, existing laws are well equipped to deal with these situations. They were well equipped to deal with the situation at Coots, Emerson, at the Ambassador Bridge, and I submit that they are well equipped to be used here in Ottawa. The Minister of Justice said earlier, and the Minister of Emergency Preparedness, that they were required to pass this so they could requisition essential services like tow trucks. But it has been noted by many that under the criminal code, police already have the authority to requisition such services under pain of criminal sanction. That was before the Emergencies Act was brought in. So this argument that the Emergencies Act was necessary is completely absurd. I also want to note that I will be splitting my time with my honourable colleague from Regina Cabell. Now, the police already had the power to compel many of these services. The police already had the power to be coordinated with the RCMP, with the OPP, and the various police forces and national security forces throughout Canada. They have measures existing under the criminal code, mischief, intimidation, to be used against illegal protesters and blockades. Now, the government has used an argument where they're citing potential acts and threats of violence against Canadians and critical infrastructure. And this is not just any violence, they're saying. This is violence intended for the furtherance of an ideological and political objective. I'm very concerned with the language that this government is beginning to use, because that language is very similar to the language used under terrorism laws. The definition of terrorism is the use of violence to advance a political or ideological agenda. This government is using terrorism legislation against Canadian protesters. Wow. There is very little evidence that there was a serious threat to persons and critical infrastructure from these protests. There was a short-term risk. It was dealt with by law enforcement. I am very concerned, I'll address the member's question there, Ms. Heckel. I am very concerned about the situation that occurred around Coots, Alberta, where a small group of militants were arrested with firearms and with the intent to do harm. I am so thankful for law enforcement for their efforts in taking down this very real threat. And I am so confident in our law enforcement because I know they have been planning this operation for weeks. They have likely infiltrated this group. They had a plan in place, and they had the appropriate tools and expertise to deal with this dangerous situation and diffuse it before it became a very real and dangerous situation. And the fact is, Madam Speaker, that they did this before the imposition of the Emergencies Act. Clearly, they have the tools. This undermines the government's complete argument that they are justified because there were tools that were insufficient to deal with the problems. The tools have been insufficient. The threshold has not been met. I want to address some comments that have been made by this government. The Minister of Public Safety at a press conference stated very clearly and definitively that there is a connection between that militant faction at Coutts and protesters here in Ottawa. He declined to provide any evidence to back up that assertion. He was asked repeatedly by media to back up that assertion, and he failed to back up that claim. His only evidence was citing social media posts and a general tone that has been seen in protests across Canada. Now, this government has been very quick to label protesters and anyone who would oppose their political agenda. Even before the protests began, the Prime Minister called people who oppose mandatory vaccinations, which the Prime Minister did earlier in 2021, he has called them racist, misogynist, among other epithets. Now, since the beginning of the protests, the government has sought to brand and label all protesters as fringe extremists with, quote, unacceptable views. Despite this unrelenting scrutiny and rhetoric, there has still been no evidence that there are violent extremists in Ottawa. In fact, if there were, I don't know how the government could be responsible in allowing us all to be here today and walk the streets of Ottawa. It undermines their whole claim. There is no evidence that there is a plot to violently overthrow the Canadian government, despite constant repetition and saying so. I remember there was a quote from a previous Liberal minister that says, if you tell a lie big enough and loudly enough, people will totally believe it. This government is constantly saying something that they do not have the evidence to back up. And I'd like to see that evidence if they have it. We deserve to see that evidence. This act was not designed and not intended to crack down on peaceful protesters, even if they are protesting illegally. We have other laws for dealing with this. The government is citing a so-called terrorist threat, but protesters in Ottawa, it's very inconvenient, it's terrible for the people of downtown Ottawa, but honking your horns does not meet the threshold of a terrorist organization, and the government knows that. Without further evidence of a violent threat, I cannot in good conscience support the invocation of this Emergency Act. But even if I were to accept that the government has met the threshold for calling the emergency powers, I would still have serious reservations about the powers that the government says they need to deal with this situation. If they believed there was a threat to critical infrastructure and persons, which they say they believe, I could support. If they showed evidence, I could support declaring Parliament Hill and certain sensitive areas to be a no-go zone. I could accept that we need better coordination between the RCMP and local police. But what I cannot accept is the necessity of the government undermining Section 8 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees Canadians' rights from unreasonable search and seizure to have their bank accounts frozen. The Minister of Justice on a panel last night said, if you are part of a so-called pro-Trump organization, you should be worried. I think all Canadians should be worried when a Minister of Justice threatens people because of their political views. That is not the Canada that any of us want to see, and it's unacceptable, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, throughout this debate, which we are going to be having over the next number of days, Canadians will know that their official opposition is alive and well. We are prepared to stand up for Canadians' rights. We are prepared to hold this government accountable. We're going to keep fighting. We're not going to stop standing up for Canadians' rights and freedoms. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
To the Minister of Justice.
Yep. To the Honourable.
That's to the previous Parliament, Madam Speaker. Sorry. Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. And I listened to the member's speech as I was actually walking over here on CPAC, and I'll respectfully, and I do want to try and reduce the tone of this debate, point out a couple of things. One is that what happened in Coutts, Alberta is extremely concerning for any Canadian, and I presume all parliamentarians that are concerned about violence. Secondly, that people, including outside of this very building, have openly called for the overthrow of a duly elected government, including an entity calling itself Canadian Unity. I think that is direct evidence of an ideological imperative or agenda that is being pursued. But the last point that I would gently point out to the member opposite is that I appreciated his submissions, and I mean that with all sincerity. But all that is being extended here with respect to laws that are already compliant with Section 8 of the Charter that relate to unreasonable search and seizure and FinTrack is ensuring that FinTrack can be applied to cryptocurrency and to crowdfunding sources. Is that not a necessary initiative given the foreign funding that is streaming into this country right now? If the member could...
For Sturgeon River Park. Parkland.
I want to thank the honourable member for that very good question, because I was at Public Safety Committee when Deputy Director of Intelligence Barry McKillop answered a question from one of his colleagues who said, why aren't we covering these crowdfunding sources? That's obviously a big loophole. And the Deputy Director stated that the payment processors that move the money from individuals to the crowdsourcing pages report to FinTrack. And the Canadian banks that receive the money from the crowdsourcing efforts report to the Canadian government. He stated there are no such thing as anonymous donations because everyone must provide their name and their credit card. There are no anonymous donations. FinTrack knows exactly who's donating, exactly where the money's going. They have the tools that they need. We do not need this further infringement on Canadians' rights and freedoms.
The honourable member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was listening carefully to the Conservative colleague's speech. Clearly, the Bloc and the Conservatives intend to oppose this. That is the application of the Emergencies Act, but for visibly and clearly very different reasons. The Bloc is opposed because it is the unanimous will of the National Assembly of Quebec and the government in power in Quebec to not allow the federal government to interfere in its business and impose the Emergencies Act, which is a bit of a bitter pill for Quebecers who remember back to 1970. The colleague instead was talking about the absence of proof that there were in the demonstrations and the occupation that we currently see here in Ottawa, the absence of evidence that there are more radical elements that could threaten security and individuals and national security itself eventually. Can the colleague confirm that he doesn't see these in these illegal demonstrations elements that could be dangerous for public safety? Does he trust what he sees on social networks and what we see in other areas happening in terms of demonstrations? I'd like to have his comments on that. Thank you.
For Sturgeon River Parkland.
I want to thank the honourable member for that question. And you could go on Twitter right now and find some of the most outrageous, offensive, and criminal statements across Canada. But what we do not in this country is base the passage of laws and the invocation of emergency acts based upon the possibility of a threat. We must base it on a real threat. We must base it on evidence that there is a threat to Canadians. And the fact that we are allowed to walk freely through this parliamentary precinct with protesters less than 100 meters from us right now belies the fact that it undermines the claim that there is a serious threat to Canadian democracy. Thank you.
Member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The honourable colleague across the way, I find it very difficult. He was talking about that people were just honking their horns, and that he seemed to try and allude that this convoy was just a simple annoyance for the people in Ottawa. However, I've spoken to quite a few who are working in the downtown. I had a lovely young woman who served me lunch at a restaurant, and I asked her how she was doing. And she talked about the harassment. She talked about specific assaults. She talked about the assaults to friends of hers that were working in the market. That is what we need to address here. So I wonder if he could explain, Madam Speaker, why he seems to think that this is just a simple annoyance and why he would want to take away from the safeties of the people who are working and living in this downtown.
River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. The member is putting words in my mouth. I'm not saying that this is a simple inconvenience for the people of downtown Ottawa. I'm not downplaying the experiences that she's telling. I believe they are true experiences. They are unacceptable experiences, and they are experiences that can be dealt with through existing laws. Harassment is a crime. Intimidation is a crime. It's up to police to enforce these measures. We do not need emergency powers to enforce existing laws. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Regina Capel.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for agreeing to share his time with me. I think it's very important for Canadians to understand that this is in no way, that the government's reaction, the government's proposal to invoke the Emergency Measures Act is in no way connected to public safety, to restoring order, or to upholding the rule of law. We know this because we know what they've done with previous protests and blockades. When the Prime Minister agrees with the aims of protesters, he does nothing. In fact, actually, it would be unfair to say he does nothing. He does nothing to end the blockades. He actually will send negotiators. He'll actually send government delegations to meet with protesters and even propose settlements and compromises when he agrees with the political aims of those protesting. We know this because in 2020, anti-energy protesters, anti-oil and gas worker protesters held up vital transportation links for weeks, Madam Speaker. At the time, the Prime Minister had a much different tone. Let's take a look at what he said when vital transportation links, when rail lines were blockaded, crippling the Canadian economy for weeks and weeks at a time. He said, and I quote, "Therefore, we are creating a space for peaceful, honest dialogue with willing partners." Compare that to the rhetoric and inflammatory language that he has used over the past several weeks here in 2022. Make no mistake, Madam Speaker, the protests that are happening in Ottawa and that have taken place across the country are a direct result of the Prime Minister's actions and his rhetoric. The demonization of people who are fighting to get their rights back. After 2 years of incredible hardship, 2 years of politicians and government agencies telling people that they weren't allowed to have family members visit them inside their own home. After 2 years of governments telling business owners that they had to keep their doors shut and their employees laid off. After years of people not able to use the various support systems that they've had in their life, relying on friends and family. Gyms closed, activities for children canceled. After 2 years of this, just as there is hope on the horizon, as other jurisdictions around the world and even here in Canada were lifting restrictions and easing mandates, the Prime Minister added a new one. He added a new restriction after 2 years of telling truck drivers that they were essential services, that they were be allowed to travel across the border to bring vital goods into our markets. After 2 years of deeming them that essential service, just as there was hope and reasons to lift restrictions and mandates, the Prime Minister added a new one without any data to back it up, without any evidence to back it up. Then when people started objecting to this, finally saying enough is enough, we want our freedoms back, Madam Speaker. It's time for the government to retreat back to the normal boundaries of government interference in our lives. When people started doing that, started to gather together to peacefully protest against government overreach, what did the Prime Minister do? He called them names, tried to smear them with broad brushes. He called them racists and misogynists. He asked the question, the rhetorical question, Madam Speaker, about whether or not we should tolerate these people. Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister a question. What does not tolerating these people look like? Because what he's done over the past few weeks has just been shameful. This Prime Minister has lowered the office in which he serves to unprecedented depths. In my 17 years of being a member of Parliament, I've never seen a Prime Minister, for that matter, any other politician, so debase the office that they hold, hurling insults at people, referring to a Jewish member of this House as standing with people waving swastikas. Just outrageous, Madam Speaker. And I have to tell my honourable colleagues in the Liberal benches who have often admonished their political opponents, for in any way, even sharing the same postal code as someone who may be holding an offensive flag or a placard with unacceptable language on it. And when conservatives denounce that, that's not good enough for members of the Liberal Party. They say, you're supposed to paint the entire group protesting with that broad brush. But, Madam Speaker, they don't hold themselves to that same standard. I see many honourable members across the way, some of whom I've served with. I know them to be honourable people. I don't assume that they are all racists just because their leader has performed racist acts by putting on blackface so often in his life that he can't remember how many times he's done it. We don't paint every single Liberal member of Parliament with that brush. They have no problem being photographed with the Prime Minister, despite his history of racist acts. So neither should members of Parliament hold or paint the entire group of people who are protesting for their freedoms back with that same broad brush. The lengths at which this government, and indeed not just the government, but many of their friends in the corporate media, to paint every single person who's protesting, who's demanding an end to the restrictions, an end to mandates with that broad brush, Madam Speaker. You look at the lengths that they go to discredit and to dehumanize those people who are just fighting for their traditional civil liberties. And I ask you, Madam Speaker, if we kind of look at this in two different groups. On the one hand, you've got people who are saying after 2 years of hardship, 2 years of sacrifice, 2 years of being forced to comply with unprecedented government intrusion in our lives, unprecedented. Government's telling you where you can go, who you can have in your house. That is a new level of government interference in our life that we have not seen in recent Canadian history. After 2 years of that, there's a group of people who are saying, I just don't believe I should be fired for making a healthcare decision. Then on the other hand, you've got a group of people who are saying that anybody who holds that view is a racist, a misogynist, an insurrectionist, Madam Speaker. You've got a group of people who are saying that government should have the ability to tell you who you can have in your house, whether or not your business is allowed to stay open. Which group seems more unreasonable, Madam Speaker? I would say after 2 years, those who are fighting against this government intrusion in their lives have a legitimate case to be made. Whether or not we agree with them or not, we must respect their right to advocate for their views. The Prime Minister has not provided any legitimate justification for bringing in the Emergency Measures Act. He asks us to trust him. He says, don't worry, we're going to make sure everything's fine with the courts, we're going to make sure everything's compliant with the Charter. This is the same guy who fired his Attorney General because she wouldn't go along with his plans to interfere in a criminal court case, Madam Speaker. So you will pardon the members of the Conservative Party if we're not going to take the Prime Minister's word that he's not going to abuse the power that he's granting himself. He points to specific incidences that Conservatives also denounced. We denounced the rail blockades in 2020, and we denounced the border blockades in 2022. Because, Madam Speaker, we do not believe that the right to peacefully protest should mean that you get to infringe on the freedom and rights of other people. But when we raised that point in 2020, calling on the government to do something about the rail blockades when it was the anti-energy workers, who, by the way, there are a lot of radical left-wing protests across the country where you see all kinds of placards, anti-Semitic placards. You see banners advocating violence committed against police officers. You don't see the government rushing to crack down on that. They're talking about foreign funding, Madam Speaker. How about the foreign funding that's poured into Canada by the hundreds of millions to help groups fight against energy projects and natural resource projects across the country? Didn't seem to bother the government then, Madam Speaker. But now all of a sudden they say that they've got to do something about it. It's a little bit like that scene in Casablanca when the inspector comes to Rick and says, sorry, I have to close the place down. There's illegal gambling going on. And then the croupier comes over and puts his winnings in his pocket. That's what this government is doing. For years, they've relied on foreign funding coming to help their allies in the political spectrum fight for their goals and fight against Canadians and their interests. So, Madam Speaker, I'm just going to close on this. This is the exact same playbook that we've seen dictatorial governments across the country. They dehumanize their opponents. They have they invoke threats of foreign influence. Remember, the Berlin Wall was built to keep others out, ostensibly. Governments always talk about their good intentions when they take away rights and liberties. But I'm asking Canadians not to be fooled by this. And I'm asking members of the Liberal Party who actually believe in civil liberties, who actually do believe in the natural limits of government, to do the right thing.
Questions and comments by the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Sport.
I had to just rush back into the House. I was sitting in the lobby and listening to that speech, and I just couldn't believe how willing the member from Regina Capel was to just justify all these behaviors we're seeing. I saw a video of him crossing the road this morning, giving a thumbs up and shaking hands with people who've been occupying this capital city for the last 3 weeks. And my direct question to the member is, if this was happening in Regina, if his neighbors were being occupied and harassed downtown and were afraid to leave their homes, would your position be exactly the same as it is here? Would you be giving them a thumbs up every single day?
Speak to the chair, if you don't, the Honourable Member for Regina Capel.
This member comes from a caucus whose leader sent a delegation to protesters. He's saying that I shouldn't wave back to people who wave to me. His government actually sent a minister with a mandate to negotiate. Madam Speaker, I'm Canadian. I'll wave at people when they wave to me. I'll say hello to people who say hello to me. When I have constituents who have left their homes to come and fight for their freedoms, I will listen to them. I will be civil. Because if the government had started off this whole thing with that type of attitude, we might not even be having this debate today, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Pagode. Thank you, Madam Speaker. As you know, the Conservatives and the Bloc are both going to vote against the motion today, but there's something that I'd like to understand. In 2012, 10 years ago, there was a student crisis in Quebec, and there were partisans of the Conservative Party who said, come on, let's go in with the hard line. And so same thing in 2020, the Bloc tabled a motion to apologize to victims of the War Measures Act, but the Conservatives voted against our motion. So all of a sudden there's this truckers' protest. So why, when it's the Conservatives' grassroots base that is in play, then all of a sudden the hard line doesn't apply? Because, and they even say that climate change doesn't exist.
Madam Speaker, my honourable colleague, first of all, I will start off my remarks by thanking the members of the Bloc Québécois, because we disagree on many things philosophically, but it's nice to know that even if we disagree on policy, that there's still some common ground on the principles about using the sledgehammer that the government's brought in. But the member is invoking a series of events that happened in 2012. The Conservative Party didn't bring in the Emergency Measures Act in 2012. Mm-hmm. It's legitimate. There are going to be protests across the country, across time, where various parties are going to agree with the aims of the protests or disagree. And we can all express our opinion about whether or not those protests should be happening. But the government should not be bringing in this massive sledgehammer to crack down on dissent when there are existing laws. The Prime Minister talked about Coots. That was resolved. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the indulgence. The Prime Minister talked about the Coots border crossing. It was resolved with existing laws, with existing tools that law enforcement have. There's no need for this act.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Saanich Grove Highlands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Honourable Member for Regina Capel, I found his speech disturbing at many levels. There were more dog whistles to a rabid base of Trump supporters in one short speech than I've heard ever in this place. But I'd like to correct the record and ask the Honourable Member to consider that when the Government of Canada sent a delegation, it was because the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have Supreme Court of Canada on their side, that they have a continuity of leadership, territorial responsibility that goes back to our Constitution, Supreme Court of Canada. The Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs required that both British Columbia and the Government of Canada, in the honour of the Crown, sent representatives to discuss the situation with them. They were not protesters, they were chiefs.
For Regina Capel.
Well, Madam Speaker, I believe the honourable member may be the only member of this House who's actually arrested for participating in an illegal protest. So for her to now somehow justify the Emergency Measures Act, would she have appreciated it while she was breaking laws and getting arrested if the government had the power to freeze her bank account, Madam Speaker? Would she have appreciated anybody who made a donation to the Green Party at that time having their bank accounts frozen for supporting her illegal activities, Madam Speaker? I doubt it.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for King's Heads.
Madam Speaker, I'll be sharing my time with my honourable colleague from Outremont this afternoon. Today I rise to deliver what may be the most important speech I've given since having the privilege to serve the people of King's Heads in the House. Today, we as parliamentarians are debating whether the government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act on Monday was justified. I submit to my colleagues in this House, and indeed all Canadians watching, that the threshold required to trigger the Emergency Act has been objectively met and perhaps exceeded. As the Prime Minister has said in this House, a decision of this nature is not taken lightly. However, the situation we have seen across the country is serious and warrants a response that is proportionate to the impact we have seen on all Canadians. Let me be very clear. I am in full support of legal protests in this country. It is a constitutionally protected right, and indeed I have spoken to some of my own constituents who in their own way have demonstrated their displeasure with the government's protocols to date. However, we have to delineate between lawful protest and individuals who refuse to abide by the rule of law, who have occupied Ottawa and who have blockaded our key border crossings. I believe it's incumbent on all of us to look at the facts and to try to be objective. We have seen a group of individuals in Ottawa who have occupied the city for now 3 weeks. This despite orders from law authorities to disperse and to go home. The key organizers of the Ottawa occupation have openly espoused their goal of overthrowing the government, of meeting with the Governor-General to form a coalition. We've had blockades across the country at key border crossings, which have targeted the country's trade relationship, including at Windsor, Coutts, and Emerson. At Coutts, the RCMP have found weapons and body armor. How can one conclude that this was simply a peaceful protest? The Minister of Public Safety outlined to this House this morning what the impact was having across the country economically. Hundreds of millions of dollars a day in economic harm, blocking critical infrastructure, critical trade routes that hurts everyday Canadians. It impacts our food security and our supply chain. There has been a targeted impact of the Ottawa International Airport, and the organizers of the Freedom Convoy have expressed their desire to reestablish blockades and occupations elsewhere, even if they were taken down by police. We also know that these activities are being financed by international sources. I ask members of these House, do we as parliamentarians have a responsibility to take action on internationally financed activities to organizers of activity that is not only illegal, but indeed represents a threat to Canadian security and the rule of law? I, for one, believe we do. I want to be crystal clear. This is being done to target activities that are illegal and threatening the economic health of the country and the rule of law and order. For those whose intent is to raise issues about government policy, I have no issue. For those who continue to be a part of illegal blockades here in Ottawa or elsewhere, you do not have the ability to do so, and these measures are being implemented because of your unwillingness to abide by the law. So what is the public emergency order being invoked under the Emergencies Act? What does it actually mean? The Conservatives would have you believe this government is limiting all freedoms. These measures do not take away freedoms. The Bloc would suggest that this is akin to the War Measures Act and are seeking to drum up memories of the FLQ crisis. This is not the War Measures Act. It is not taking away the rights of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it is not calling in the Army. This is a specific measure to give additional powers to police and provincial authorities to maintain law and order, monitor the financing, including from foreign sources, that is being used to block and undermine critical infrastructure, and to ultimately remove the blockades and occupations that exist across the country. Let's examine the actual measures in the order. The regulation and prohibition of public assemblies that lead to a breach of the peace and go beyond lawful protest. I want to be clear, lawful protests can continue. Designated and securing places where blockades are to be prohibited. Directing persons to render essential services to relieve impacts of blockades on Canada's economy. So this could include things like tow trucks, Madam Speaker, that could be requisitioned, of course, for compensation by government authorities to help removing trucks and vehicles that are blockading key infrastructure. Authorizing or directing financial institutions to render essential services that relieve the impact of blockades, including regulating and prohibiting the use of property to fund and support the blockades that are undermining economic security in the country. Measures enabling the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaw and provincial offences where required, and the imposition of fines under Section 19 of the Emergencies Act. I submit to this House that these measures are specific, they are time-limited, and geographically focused. The measures will be overseen by a joint parliamentary committee and, of course, must be supported by a majority in this House to remain in force. I have previously mentioned that policing is in the domain of municipalities and the provincial government. Madam Speaker, since day one, our government was and continues to work directly with municipal and provincial authorities and their law enforcement. We've answered calls for additional resources. We helped create integrated operations and additional RCMP officers to try and deal with blockades. Leading into Monday's decision, it was clear that the provincial and municipal authorities were being unable to address the situation. Ironically, members of this House were calling us to show federal leadership. Some Conservatives, after openly encouraging illegal activity to continue, and were asking the government to stop the blockades. Well, these measures are designed to do exactly that. My question to members in this House who are criticizing the government for making available time-limited tools under the Emergencies Act to support law enforcement, what intermediate step would you suggest the government should have undertaken? Beyond asking the Prime Minister to meet with individuals who fly flags that say F-U-C-K, Trudeau, and want to overthrow a democratically elected government and have stated that they will not leave until their demands are met, what security measures would you have suggested this government should have undertaken? That is the key question. As my constituents, Madam Speaker, have rightfully pointed out, it is easy to be an armchair critic, but I have yet to hear much constructive measures on the other side of the House on how to deal with the current situation. Madam Speaker, I support the government's measures. They are reasonable, they are balanced, and they are proportionate to the circumstances we have seen. They are focused on giving tools to police in jurisdictions across the country to resolve illegal blockades that are hurting everyday Canadians. And I think it's extremely important for all of us to remember that these are tools that are available. This order is in effect for 30 days. This is to make sure that we have the ability to address the circumstances that we've seen. I would hope that all members of this House believe that this is an important measure so that we can make sure that the blockades, the economic harm, and frankly, the lack of rule and order that we've seen in certain elements of this country do not continue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I look forward to taking questions from my honourable colleagues.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Edmonton West.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech today. Earlier we heard from one of his colleagues that the government says they know what a lawful protest looks like. I'm wondering why the government then did not act when we had protesters blockading Via Rail, CN Rail, blocking the Port of Vancouver, crippling our economy and crippling pipelines and oil and gas transfer to the point that Alberta companies are offering to truck propane to Quebec. Why is that considered a lawful protest not to be subject to such extreme draconian acts that the government is bringing in now compared to what's going on right now?
Member for Kings Heads.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I anticipated the question because I've noticed on this side of the House, on the opposite side, that the members are trying to create that narrative. In fact, I find they've been inconsistent in their own way in the fact that they were very quick to call on government action back in 2020 and were silent for nearly 2 weeks on what we've seen in Ottawa and elsewhere in the country. The difference for me, Madam Speaker, of why this rises to the level of the Emergency Act is the fact that there has been an open, stated goal of those that have been involved in the protest to actually overthrow government and to cause disruption and harm to Canadians. I will go on record and say it is absolutely unacceptable, regardless of the motions or the notion and desire of protesters to block critical infrastructure. I support measures that do that, including in this way here today.
Député de Thérèse de Blainville.
The honourable member for Thérèse de Blainville. Thank you, Madam Speaker. First, I'd like to say that I am in complete disagreement with the Emergencies Act and its application. That is the object of debate today. Unlike the colleague who just spoke, and unlike the Prime Minister from whom we heard this morning, who called this bill reasonable and proportionate, I find it completely disproportionate and unreasonable. I would like to put the following question to my colleague. When you say which intermediate measures would have been put in place, I would like to ask him why, from the outset, didn't you put in place political and public safety measures instead of letting this blockade dig in front of Parliament Hill?
Madam Speaker, in the absence of federal government leadership, ordinary people, brave as they may be, put themselves in harm's way because of this government. Protecting the people is the cornerstone of the contract between citizens and the government. Does the government understand the consequences of its lack of leadership? That was from the critic from the Bloc Québécois 4 days ago. What do they expect federal government leadership to look like? Do they suggest that it looks like what the Conservatives are calling for, that the government just simply does as those outside Wellington are asking for and just eliminate any public health measure related to COVID? What we are doing is very simple. We are giving tools to local law authorities, including in Quebec, to use at their discretion to avoid what we've seen across the country. Would the member opposite think that it is a good idea to have those tools available such that if there was a blockade at Lacal, that is not something that we can do to be able to address that situation? And it's ironic because they say, why didn't this happen at the time? The reality is it has to work its way to a federal level, which it has over the past 3 weeks. Had we intervened at the first time, they would have been the same party to say that it was an overstep and to respect provincial jurisdiction. It is hypocrisy.
Member for Timmins James Bay.
Speaker, having been in Ottawa for most of this blockade, what I've seen is a complete lack of willingness of the police to do their job. Yes. This should never have spiraled. This was allowed to metastasize and create a crisis at our borders, cutting off hundreds of millions of dollars of trade. I remember when the Conservatives were saying that if 10 unvaccinated truckers didn't get to cross the border, we'd have all our supply lines and our stores shut down. When that didn't happen, their supporters actually shut the border. But I'd like to ask the honourable member, now that we're at this point, it does speak to the absolute failure of this government to have shown leadership throughout. We should never be in a situation where we're using the Emergency Act against people who are setting up hot tubs on Wellington Street because of the lack of rule of law.
For King's Hanson, 15 seconds or less.
I'll try to be very quick. The member talks about leadership. What type of leadership would he like to see? Would he like to see a federal government overreach in the first few days of imposing federal powers? Would the member suggest that leadership looks like acquiescing to what the Conservatives have said? No. What we've done is we've waited until the situation warranted a federal response. Here we are. We're putting tools in place to be able to address the situation. It's a bit of a nothing question in my mind. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Tourism, Assistant Minister of Finance.
Here. Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The debate we are having today is crucial, and I'm speaking to all members of this House, of course, but also to Canadians across the country. This week, the Government of Canada declared a state of emergency, and this decision was not taken lightly, and for good reason. Invoking the Emergencies Act is not the first thing the Government of Canada should do, or even the second, Madam Speaker. It is a last resort, but we must admit that this avenue is now necessary. The illegal blockades that have taken place across the country over the past 3 weeks have disrupted the lives of far too many Canadians. These blockades have caused significant damage to our economy and our democratic institutions. Jobs and Canada's prosperity are at stake. Because of the illegal actions that have been taken, international confidence in Canada as an investment location is now shaken, Madam Speaker. And we cannot stand by while the livelihoods of Canadian workers are threatened, while businesses, large and small, are affected by these blockades.
We will not let Canada's reputation on the international stage be tarnished. That's why we are taking action. The Emergency Economic Measures Order will allow the government to take concrete steps, concrete action to stop the financing of the illegal blockades. The main objective of these measures is to limit the flow of money that is used to finance this unlawful activity and to prevent additional financial support. As the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance has said before, this is about following the money. Two broad categories of financial measures are being enacted. First, those aimed at crowdfunding platforms and payment service providers, and second, those applicable to Canadian financial service providers. Let's look at the first one. Crowdfunding platforms and some payment service providers are not currently subject to the anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing laws that we have in this country. It therefore stands to reason that they could be used to finance unlawful activities such as the blockades that we are seeing. To address this, the order extends the scope of Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing rules to cover crowdfunding platforms and the payment processors that they use. Specifically, the entities that are in possession of any funds associated with the illegal blockades are now required to register with FINTRAC, the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, and to report suspicious and large value transactions of persons involved in the blockades. This will mitigate the risks that these platforms could be used to receive funds from illicit sources or to finance illicit activity. Second, with respect to our financial service providers, the order directs them to intervene when they suspect that an account belongs to someone participating in the illegal blockades. This means that banks, insurance companies, and other financial service providers must now temporarily cease providing financial services, including freezing their accounts when they believe an account holder or client is engaged in illegal blockades. The order applies to all funds held in a deposit, in a checking, or in a savings account, and to any other type of property. This also includes digital assets such as cryptocurrencies. As a result, Canadian financial service providers are now able to immediately freeze or suspend an account of an individual or business affiliated with these illegal blockades, and to do so without a court order, Madam Speaker. Financial service providers are also protected against civil liability for the actions that they take to comply with the order. Of course, these service providers are required to unfreeze accounts when the account holder stops assisting or participating in the illegal blockades.
With the Emergency Economic Measures Order, the government is also ordering Canadian financial institutions to review their relationships with anyone involved in illegal blockades. The order also gives federal, provincial, and territory government institutions a new power to share relevant information with banks and other financial service providers if that information will help stop financing of illegal blockades and illicit activities in Canada. Madam Speaker, the vast majority of Canadians, those who are law-abiding and are not involved in these illegal blockades, will see no difference. This order in Council will not change anything for them. These measures are designed to stop the funding that enables illegal blockades. They are targeted and temporary measures. They will apply for 30 days and are aimed at individuals and companies that are directly or indirectly involved in illegal activities that harm our economy. These are necessary measures, Madam Speaker. True, blockades are only occurring in certain parts of our country. We know that, but they are hurting the entire Canadian economy. It's also true that most parts of the country have not been the scene of these illicit activities. But the funding that enabled these illicit actions did not only come from neighborhoods where trailers were parked. It came from across the country. Moreover, some individuals have crossed interprovincial borders to participate in these activities. Activities, Madam Speaker, that I'd like to stress are illegal. Our democratic institutions are under threat. The Canadian economy is under threat. Peace, order, and good government are under threat in Canada. This is unacceptable. We must end it, and we will end it.
The message is clear. From the finance perspective, if people are funding blockades that harm the Canadian economy, their bank account will be frozen. If people that fund blockades think that they can get around the law by using cryptocurrencies, that won't work. If a company's truck is used in illegal activity, the vehicle's insurance will be suspended and the company's bank accounts will be frozen. Semi-trailers, they should be on our roads, Madam Speaker, not parked for weeks on end in front of Parliament. They should be delivering the goods and the services and that will grow our economy, not holding up traffic at border crossings or paralyzing our city centres. Cela dit,
nevertheless, I remain optimistic. I remain optimistic that the law will soon be restored and that the blockades will be dismantled. I remain optimistic that we will end this pandemic while still being there for each other. And I remain optimistic that we can strengthen our economy, not by honking horns, but by the hard work of our entrepreneurs, of our small and large companies, and by thoughtful and responsible economic policies. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Before we go to questions and comments, I believe the Honourable Member for Regina Capel has a point of order.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to clarify the record. I misspoke during my questions and comments in response to the member for Sandwich Gulf Islands. I indicated that she was the only member of this House to have been arrested for protesting illegally. I, of course, completely forgot the image of the Minister of the Environment in his orange jumpsuit. He, too, was arrested for illegal protest. And I don't...
Noted. The Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
To the Honourable Member for Regina Capel, I would like to retain the honour of being the only Member of Parliament currently serving as a Member of Parliament when I faced arrest non-violently, surrendering immediately, and accepting the consequences, unlike our friends outside.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville. She's been waiting for a long time.
Thank you, Madam. The individual who just spoke indicated that one of the problems here is that Canada's reputation is being tarnished by this. And I would ask her, whose reputation is truly being tarnished? Canadians' reputations or this government's reputation? The stands of everyday Canadians that have been taken have gained international support and have drawn disdain directly towards the Liberal government and especially the language and actions of this Prime Minister.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I'm sure it will come as no surprise, Madam Speaker, that I entirely disagree. I think that there are many people that have fallen to how can I say, Canadians have lost confidence in many different institutions as a result of what has been happening over the course of the last 3 weeks. Top of mind is the police. I believe that many Canadians right across the country question whether law enforcement was there, and this Emergency Measures Act provides more tools to our police force in order to maintain confidence in law and order in this country.
The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Madam Speaker, my colleague did mention that her government will not allow Canada's reputation to be tarnished by the events. Right now, the flag has become a symbol of the extreme right and of disorder. I would like to know, given that her speech seems to have written 3 weeks ago, does she agree with, does she need some help with her agenda? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Canada's flag is the flag of all Canadians and of all Quebecers, and I wear it proudly every day. I'd like to answer my colleague because I didn't really understand his very strange question, but I'd like to also stress that I see that Quebecers agree with the application of the Emergencies Act. In fact, more than 70% of Quebecers approve the invocation of this act, Madam Speaker, and I am proud to represent them. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I first would like to say that I hold this government responsible for letting these extreme right convoy members into the downtown area, but I'd like to understand there is a collective memory of Quebecers when the War Measures Act was invoked. Today, we cannot compare what was happening at the time to what's happening today. Fundamental rights are being protected, and there is a time limitation. Does this reassure my colleague? Because all parliamentarians will have powers to guarantee limits. Madam Speaker, I find myself agreeing entirely with my colleague from Rosemont. We're talking here about a totally different act. The Emergencies Act is not at all the same as the War Measures Act that was used in 1970. We're not sending soldiers to the ground, and I agree that there is transparency and powers for all parliamentarians to end the application of this act. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I noticed today some very interesting public opinion polling coming out of Quebec. As a matter of fact, it says that 72% of Quebecers support the use of the Emergency Measures Act. More importantly, Abacus data that's been released recently say that 63% of Bloc supporters in the last election would never vote for an MP that supports the occupation going on outside. Yet the Bloc seems to be showing their support for the occupation. I'm wondering if the Parliamentary Secretary can provide some insight into that.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I think I will address this question in French with the permission of my colleague.
And I agree, as I said earlier, that the vast majority of Quebecers are in favor of applying this act. And I would also say that the approval rating is even higher in Quebec than the rest of the country. So, yes, I do think that we have to be very cautious when we're talking on behalf of Quebecers, like the other side of the House is saying, as members of the Bloc.
Debate, the Honourable Member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I will be splitting my time for remarks with the Honourable Member from South Surrey, White Rock. Madam Speaker, it's an honour to rise on behalf of the citizens of Kamloops, Thompson Caribou, not only in this House generally, but in such important times. And sometimes we do forget what a tremendous honour it is. I'm sad, though, to be here discussing emergency measures here today. This has been a time, with respect, where the Prime Minister has inflamed, has incited, and has divided. The Prime Minister took that same inflammatory approach yesterday when he spoke in response to a question from the member from Thornhill. I was dismayed that he would not apologize or did not apologize for that today. Instead, he came into this House this morning and doubled down on years of division. So let's recap. The predecessor legislation was invoked 3 times: World War I, World War II, and the FLQ crisis. The Prime Minister invites and likes for Canadians to think that he's the common person. So I'm not sure if he has walked through downtown Ottawa of late, but I did yesterday and today, and I saw trucks in streets. There were a few streets that were plugged, and those trucks need to go, period. The question then becomes, how should that be done? Now, I took an oath when I was sworn in, and it was the greatest days of my life, to take that oath on behalf of all Canadians, and particularly on behalf of the residents of Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou. And I took my oath to do my job to the best of my ability. I have to be satisfied as a legislator that the preconditions for this act have been met. That is my job. That is the oath I took, and that is something that I take very seriously. So I read the act, and I considered it. I actually had to read it twice. I've practiced law for 14 years, Madam Speaker. I previously taught at a law school for a number of years. So when it came to my analysis of the act, I did what I taught my students to do. I went back to first legal principles, first statutory principles, and we apply legal principles and statutory principles not because it is popular, not because we want the trucks to be cleared in any way possible, but because we here, 338 of us, must apply the law. After all, the Prime Minister has made the same remarks about the rule of law. He wouldn't strip Canadians of citizenship just because it was popular, just because people may like it, but instead we must accede to the rule of law. So let's apply the rule of law, Madam Speaker. Let's apply the legislation here. This legislation is clear. It says that its application must be the last resort. Members of this House have repeatedly asked, what was step 1? Crickets. What was step 2? Crickets. The police weren't even stopping people carrying jerry cans in. What was step 3? More crickets. Word salad. The official leader of the opposition asked the Prime Minister to attend a meeting with all party leaders with a view to bringing this matter to an end, and by my count, that was about 10 days ago. Crickets. Even without the Emergencies Act application, which is alive right now, Madam Speaker, protesters could be arrested under the current regime. There are laws about causing a disturbance, mischief, and participation in these sorts of illegal activities. The Criminal Code is very clear on that, and I'm not even touching on the Ontario Highways Traffic Act. The trucks could be seized incidental to arrest as evidence. They could be seized with a warrant. All things that the police have at their disposal right here, right now, to address the very situation that the Emergencies Act says it will deal with as a last resort. These first resorts have not been addressed. So let's next look, Madam Speaker, at what was resolved without the use of the Emergencies Act. Coots, the Ambassador Bridge, Windsor. Why? Because the police had the powers to do so and used those powers. My point, Madam Speaker, is this. The legislation says that we do not resort to its use unless it is absolutely necessary. And what we have seen in these 3 instances I just mentioned is that it is not absolutely necessary. And as a legislator, I need to be convinced that the threshold has been met, or I will not vote for such legislation. I wish we could simply invoke legislation to make our problems go away. That's just not the case, Madam Speaker. It can't be done as a measure of convenience. Let's not forget, this wasn't done during 9/11. This wasn't done during COVID. This wasn't done during railway blockades that had a crippling impact on our economy and economic consequences. This wasn't done throughout many protests throughout the country. This wasn't done when BC highways and rail were washed out due to recent flooding. I recently received an inquiry from a constituent in the North Thompson area near Blue River in my riding. There have been protests in that area for years, and Blue River is a small community. Violence, threats, blockades. And I told that constituent what I am telling this House. The legislation is a last resort to be used in extraordinary circumstances of national emergency when nothing else will do. As one of the members for Ottawa here said earlier today, this has been going on for 4 weeks, and I echo that sentiment. I understand that it's been going on for 4 weeks, and those committing illegal activity need to stop. It has been going on for much longer in my riding, and those people are asking the same questions. Now, in closing, Madam Speaker, I will say this. I do agree with the Prime Minister on one point, and he did say that he is trying to save jobs. I would eliminate the plural. He's trying to save one job, his own, and that is not right. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I welcome the member to the House as a new member, but also as a fellow member of the bar. I'll politely point out that an emergency was not...
Could I ask that the people who are outside of the chamber please stop speaking so loudly? We can barely hear ourselves here. Thank you. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
So I welcome the new member. Also welcome him as a fellow member of the bar. He indicated he's read the statute. He knows full well that in terms of COVID, enacting a public welfare emergency requires the provinces to initiate such a request. No request is forthcoming. Secondly, he asked for what steps have been taken. The first step was actually the City of Ottawa declaring an emergency, which didn't render the results. The second step was the province of Ontario declaring an emergency, which hasn't rendered results. The last step, the final step, is this very important debate that we're having today. And I'm going to put to him an issue about the capability of the province under its authorities to deal with it, which I think is an order that has been made by Premier Ford fails in 2 important respects. It does not compel essential workers like tow trucks to actually tow vehicles away. And secondly, it cannot compel vehicle licenses to be suspended where that vehicle originates in another province, such as one of the Western provinces. Are those not instances of a lack of provincial authority which necessitates the usage of the Emergencies Act in this case?
A member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Well, the criminal code actually deals with all of those issues. And when the honourable member speaks about the invocation of a state of emergency, I didn't see a single thing change. He's right. I didn't see a single thing change. I didn't see any enforcement change. What was step 1? What was step 2? We can't simply do this because we don't like how something is being enforced. It should be a matter of last resort. And those steps are available in the criminal code, whether it comes to seizure, to search, or to seizure and arrest with warrant. So with respect, I disagree.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for, just a moment, Rimouski, Nejet, Témiscouata-les-Basques. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for the speech. A number of things I agree with. We heard from the Prime Minister say this morning that there were a number of solutions and that the Emergencies Act was the last resort. We don't know the first measure, the second, the third taken. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague the following question. A government that is unable to ensure security when it comes to truckers' demonstrations, does that government deserve to be sitting on the UN Security Council?
The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
I would thank the honourable minister for his remarks. I look forward to someday hopefully being, pardon me? Oh, sorry, did I say minister? Honourable member, I misspoke. I thank the honourable member for his remarks. The Prime Minister declared Canada is back when he was first elected. The problem is this. You can say anything you want to say, but at the end of the day, it's actions that people will judge. And when people look at actions, they look at integrity. And we have a Prime Minister that, with respect, has not displayed a great deal of integrity, whether it comes to ethical breaches or it comes to a deliberate desire to divide, both in this House but also with respect to Canadians. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Madam Speaker, we're seeing growing escalations. This situation is clearly out of control due to the lack of leadership from all levels of government. In addition to the firearms and arrests for conspiracy to commit murder in Coots, an attempted arson of a residential building in the occupation area, convoy members have been deputizing themselves and now claim they have the lawful authority to detain and arrest others. Madam Speaker, I don't recall the honourable member mentioning the seriousness of the violent terror cell apprehended at Coots on conspiracy to commit murder. No one wants to see someone get hurt here, yet this is a recipe for disaster. Does the honourable member and the Conservatives not view this situation as an emergency?
For Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
I'm very clear here. When we talk about the legislation, has the threshold been met? Simply saying, do you review it this way colloquially, isn't the question that is before this House. The question, Madam Speaker, that's before this House is, has the threshold been met? And with respect, I don't believe it has been, because I don't view this as the act of last resort. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It is a somber time in this House to be speaking. It is a seminal time in Canadian history, in my view. It is apparent to me that we seem to be living in two Canadas. There is the Canada of fear and division promoted by the current Prime Minister and the leader of the NDP, confirmed by their caucuses. But there's another Canada out there, a united and proud nation that has sacrificed and done without and suffered economically, physically, and in their mental health condition. This is a Canada that is a bit worn out, plainly speaking, but still firmly patriotic and ready to take on whatever the future brings. They are Canadians who do not share this PM's post-national narrative and embrace the essence of Canada that they see themselves as a part of, as the true North, strong and free. In our national anthem, we call out to God and we pray that He keep our land glorious and free. The truth is that Canada can only be glorious if it is free, meaning its people are free, free from tyranny, free from government abusing its awesome powers, mindful of the responsibility and trust given to it in a representative democracy. Because this Prime Minister wants to dwell in the extreme, infringe and false narratives of what is happening during peaceful protests, I am choosing to address those other Canadians. I remember the historical term, the two solitudes, Mr. Speaker, in reference to impasses between Anglophone and Francophone people in Canada. Its meaning was meant to refer to a perceived lack of communication and, moreover, a lack of will to communicate. Here today we see history repeating itself, Madam Speaker. A lack of communication, but more significantly, a lack of will to communicate between the present federal government and Anglophone and Francophone citizens alike. The Emergency Act is extraordinary legislation. Extraordinary means remarkable, exceptional, unusual, and uncommon. The measures in this Act are to be entered into reservedly, advisedly, and with extreme caution. Through all the trials and tribulations of a newly created and burgeoning nation, trying to unite coast to coast to coast, through other public health emergencies, through other civil unrest, our federal government saw fit to invoke the Emergency Act and its precursor, the War Measures Act, only 4 times in our history. These extraordinary measures were used in World War I, World War II, Prime Minister Trudeau I, and Prime Minister Trudeau II. Excuse me. World War I, World War II, a previous Prime Minister in the 1970s, and the current Prime Minister. It was not invoked, Madam Speaker, during the fears and protests around the Spanish flu. It was not invoked during the workers' strikes in the 1930s, not invoked during the crises in Oka or Ipperwash or Caledonia, during the aftermath of 9/11, during crippling national strikes affecting our supply chains, during the rail blockades or pipeline protests, also negatively affecting the Canadian economy. The list is long, Madam Speaker. The point is, where other methods and authorities exist to deal with serious disagreement, government should use those methods and authorities. Government should not subjugate free people to abusive, wide-ranging, freedom-altering overreach of government. A Liberal member asking a question earlier in this debate said to the Leader of the Opposition, well, what if this happened in your neighbourhood, in your riding? Well, it did happen in my neighbourhood, Madam Speaker, and in my riding. It happened at one of the border crossings in South Surrey, White Rock. I received many reports on the ground about the activities there. I did have 3 complaints through national media calling the people involved the same outrageous, inflammatory names that the Liberal Party and the Prime Minister have been using. There were no complaints to my office. On the other side, I have had overwhelming outpourings of support from my constituents because the supporting protests were meaningful to those in attendance, and even joyful in hope for change. What kind of change? Not necessarily a change in government, although that might happen in the next federal election, but most definitely a change in federal government approach. On 2 previous weekends, vehicle after vehicle, in support of the right to protest, this government's policies, actions, and inactions drove in a rolling loop around those border crossings and highways in South Surrey, with thousands, not hundreds, thousands of Canadians cheering them on from the sides of the roads and on highway overpasses. Those involved were vocal but peaceful, holding high Canadian flags, singing the national anthem, saying prayers, and greeting others cheerfully, including the police. The result, Madam Speaker, is that the border has been cleared. Goods are flowing, and the police, using tools already at their disposal, were able to show both respect for the protesters and clear any impasses. Why is the Emergencies Act needed now in my riding? It isn't. The only distress being expressed right now from my riding is that the Prime Minister and his cabinet are showing disdain, having inflamed the situation, are not even attempting to engage in dialogue, and saw the only tool in their toolbox to be taking more power unto themselves. I have heard from many civil enforcement officers, civil liberties scholars, and lawyers on this subject, Madam Speaker. Collectively, they want me to remind the House that a public order event is not necessarily an emergency. We are down to a protest in a few blocks of downtown Ottawa. That's all. With some proper policing, the situation in Ottawa can be brought to a conclusion, as it has been elsewhere. Unlike some of the other events in downtown Ottawa, our nation's capital, we're not at a U.S. border, so it does not affect imports and exports. I'm not sure who the Leader of the NDP was referring to when he said, "Don't let your anger turn into hatred." The Prime Minister has turned his back literally on a large segment of Canadian citizens, showing them nothing but derision and disdain. This only escalates, never de-escalates, tension and disagreement. I had occasion, Madam Speaker, early in my career to attend advanced negotiation classes at Harvard Law School under the supervision of Professor Roger Fisher, the author of the acclaimed book, titled Getting to Yes. There are necessary steps that should be taken in any conflict resolution. Some form of engagement, de-escalation, respectful dialogue, looking to best alternatives to resolve the conflict, short of the only one the PM has employed, which has been described as the nuclear option. I agree that we should never have been at this moment looking like a failed nation state. We are looking this way due to weak and ineffective leadership. It is that simple. Why invoke this act now when it was not invoked all those times before? The federal government should be talking to and engaging with citizens to resolve this conflict by introducing a plan to get back to normal. Instead, we have seen the federal government demonize and insult our fellow Canadians. Remember, Prime Minister, they are all Canadians out there on Wellington Street, and a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. I'm pretty sure I heard that somewhere before. Instead of creating a plan, engaging in dialogue, and looking for a peaceful solution, the Prime Minister is looking to invoke and stoke more fear and division. Countries around the world and Canadians themselves at home are looking at this and wondering, is this my Canada? Is this the Canada I have believed in patriotically, firmly, and with a full heart for so long? The truth is that the Prime Minister and the government initiated these protests by Canadians by calling them down in the first place and then not dealing with it as it unfolded. I think back to a former leader of the Progressive Conservative Party that went along with the former Prime Ministers who invoked the War Measures Act, and then for the third time in Canadian history, and not during wartime, Madam Speaker. He voted for that War Measures Act. His name was Robert Stansfield. He later said it was the greatest regret of his life that he voted with the government that day. Edmund Burke is often quoted, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." Well, I stand against this measure with every fiber of my being. I will vote no. This is a free country, and its people should be free to protest, free to exercise their given human rights, and we need to respect and engage them. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you very much, Madam
Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, throughout this pandemic, the people of Dartmouth Cole Harbour have shown the very best that Canada has to offer. From embracing public health measures like staying the blazes home to mourning incredible tragedies together. We've been there for each other while keeping 6 feet apart. And like all Canadians, this pandemic has worn us down. We are so tired. But just as public health measures are easing, those who seek to harm our country and our democracy through conspiracy theories and misinformation are using this opportunity to sow discord. I always see the best in people, but the rise in hate is so high. Folks in our community, our neighbors, our friends are finding themselves caught up in this. And I know that this hate and this hostility is not at the heart of who we are. Madam Speaker, I ask that all Canadians be there for each other by speaking out against misinformation and standing up against hate. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Niagara West.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I think I speak for most Canadians when I say the last 2 years have been extremely difficult. At times like this, one would think that the leader of our country, the Prime Minister, would be there to unite Canadians. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. He's done the opposite. Don't take my word for it. His own Liberal MPs have said so. The Prime Minister chose to divide Canadians as a political strategy to win an election. He pitted one Canadian against the other for his own political gain. He called Canadians tired of mandates and restrictions a fringe minority with unacceptable views. He said they're extremists, misogynist, racist, and asked if these Canadians should be tolerated. This Prime Minister has fanned the flames of division to a point of a national crisis, and his solution is to divide Canadians further, to implement unprecedented and extreme government measures through the Emergencies Act. This is a crisis that he himself created. Madam Speaker, where does this Prime Minister's recklessness stop?
The Honourable Member for Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak about Black History Month, and I know I'm not the only one to do that this month, but it should be spoken about often, which is why this year's theme is February and Forever, celebrating Black history today and every day. We need to remember Black history is Canadian history, which at times has been for the worse, but over the years has become significantly for the better. Our communities are enriched by our Black neighbours and friends who take on many important roles. The Honourable Jean Augustine, who proposed the motion we recognize February as Black History Month, was the first Black woman elected to this House. Her election showed that this House could truly be a house for all Canadians. I want to take this time to recognize and thank a community leader in Aurora. Fiona Durant came to Canada as a young woman and established a small, successful local business. She also founded the Aurora Black Community Association. This is a dynamic, change-making group focused on uniting all the varied...
L'honorable député de Longueuil.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Thank you, Madam Speaker. February is Black History Month. And at the Longueuil Municipal Council, barriers from the past have been broken, leaving more space for youth, women, and diversity. Therefore, I'd like to proudly congratulate 3 extraordinary women on their appointment to the Municipal Council. Reine Bombo-Alara is the first chair of the council from a diverse background. Afine Luala-Lika is the first Black woman on the executive committee. And Rolande Balma, who is 21 years old, the youngest woman ever elected in the history of Longueuil. The arrival of these 3 Black women on Longueuil's Municipal Council represents extraordinary progress and reflects the Quebec of today. Young people from a diverse background feel, thanks to this election, that political participation is possible.
Alfred Pellin.
The Honourable Member for Alfred Pellin. Madam Speaker, this is School Retention Week, and we need to encourage our youth. Despite the difficulties of the last few years, they retain a thirst for learning. And The teachers, support staff, and other people in our schools who are supporting our youth are also showing perseverance and resilience in helping our youth to succeed. The hard work of community organizations also makes a huge difference in the lives of youth who have a harder time. They are helping these students to find meaning in their school life and motivate them to continue staying in school. Last but not least, we must also thank parents who help their children every day, support them, and help them continue with their learning. We'd like to thank everyone who helps our youth to stay motivated in school. I would like to wish Happy School Retention Week to all.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, February is Black History Month, and I wanted to take this opportunity to recognize the work being undertaken by the Niagara Military Museum, which is located in my riding. In partnership with the Canadian War Museum, the volunteers of the Niagara Military Museum worked to develop an incredible Black military history collection, which was publicly unveiled in Niagara last February. The Canadian War Museum is now showcasing these educational panels here in Ottawa so more Canadians can learn about the important contributions Black Canadians made to the defense of Canada and our freedoms. Entitled A Community at War, the Military Service of Black Canadians of the Niagara Region, the exhibition highlights the experiences of 22 Black men and women from the Niagara Region and from southwestern Ontario who served their country in uniform from the American Revolution to present day. Their experiences offer insight into the broader experiences of Black Canadians and this country's military history, and I invite all Canadians to visit the War Museum to see this marvelous exhibit. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recently had the pleasure of meeting with family doctors from the Fraser Northwest Division of Family Practice Society, who won the $100,000 grand prize for Canada's Vaccine Community Innovation Challenge. Their Physician on a Mission campaign amplified the voices of family doctors in Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam, and beyond as trusted community members to encourage vaccinations using physicians' personal stories and expertise. Videos were produced in English, Cantonese, Korean, Farsi, and Arabic, with family doctors addressing common questions about COVID-19 vaccines, from helping new mothers to reminding us to get our second shot. This initiative has empowered Canadians to make informed decisions about their health and to protect each other. Congratulations to Dr. Yoon and the Fraser Northwest Division of Family Practice Society, and thank you for your innovative and impactful work in keeping our communities healthy.
The honourable member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges.
1 year ago, the Gurdwara Guru Nanak Darbar opened its doors for the first time in the historic and beautiful town of Hudson. And since doing so, it has served as a sacred place of worship for those of the Sikh faith in my community of Vaudreuil-Soulanges. But it's also served as so much more. In keeping with the guiding principles of kindness, generosity, and community, it has also served as a place for those in need of all faiths to enjoy a free, warm, and healthy meal prepared by dedicated volunteers. It is also a rallying point for business owners and families to come together to help one another by donating truckloads of foods and supplies to neighboring churches and community groups during this incredibly difficult time. For this and so much more, I rise in this House on behalf of my entire community to congratulate Harjit Singh Bajwa, Sarvdeep Singh Bhatt, Lukpatrai Singh Dinza, Gurinder Singh Johal, and the entire team at the Gurdwara Guru Nanak Darbar Hudson for their hard work and generosity over the last year. May the years and decades ahead continue to bring peace, joy, and fulfillment. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cypress Hills, Grassland.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in the House, and what else but to address this government's egregious overstep in invoking of the Emergencies Act. I know I've had hundreds of constituents contact me, sincerely alarmed with the implications of this Prime Minister's draconian overstep. Because this is the same Prime Minister who stated that he admired China's dictatorship. But even Chinese state media stated that while Hong Kong invoked the national security law against violent petrol bomb throwing mobs, they're shocked to see how the Canadian Prime Minister has cracked down on peaceful, pro-freedom protesters. Mr. Speaker, the world is watching this critical moment in our nation's capital, and they are rightly alarmed to see the leader of a G7 country, a country that has long been a beacon of freedom, come down on peaceful protesters with a sledgehammer. It is absolutely shameful, and I'm calling on the Prime Minister to lay aside his pride, listen to the very real concerns of the Canadian people, follow the science, and drop the mandates. That is the clearest path forward to resolving these tensions and healing our divided and wounded nation.
The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The challenges of the pandemic we've been experiencing since 2020 don't spare anyone, including youth. For many young Quebecers and Canadians, continuing in school is a huge challenge, and the current situation is not helping, whether it be due to learning difficulties, family situation, physical or mental health. We need to ensure that our children's success is at the very heart of our responsibilities as a government and society. We must focus on their success and stay engaged and mobilized for them this week and throughout the year. I'd like to thank all of the teachers, educators, support staff, and others who every day help youth find meaning in their school career. This week, School Retention Week, my team and I have supported teachers and school staff in my riding by offering them cookie baskets that were carefully collected by the Cuisine Collective in the region to thank them for the incredible work they do every day. Thank you.
Member for Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, the illegal blockades must come to an end, and law enforcement has the resources it needs to do that without the government invoking the Emergencies Act. The Prime Minister himself has said that this act should not be the first, second, or third response, but he has been unable to tell us what his first, second, and third responses were. Mr. Speaker, after taking no action, the Prime Minister is now moving to the most extreme action. And we have seen crisis in this country before, many times, in many different situations where the Emergencies Act in its current form was not utilized. Mr. Speaker, this is an unprecedented overreach, and it is a result of a failure in leadership on the part of the Prime Minister. Parliament must reverse this decision immediately.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny, Liseley, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to rise to address the House today. There are 58 municipalities in my riding, so there are many opportunities to celebrate. And many of these municipalities have reached a venerable old age. Over time, generations of citizens worked together to create communities that reflect their spirit. In the current pandemic, many committees have redoubled their efforts to find alternative ways to celebrate. And I would like to pay tribute to them. First of all, Montmagny, La Seigneurie de la Rivière-du-Sud are turning 375. Berthier-sur-Mer and Cap and I would like to pay tribute to them. First of all, Montmagny, La Seigneurie de la Rivière-du-Sud are turning 375. Berthier-sur-Mer and Cap Saint-Ignace, as well as Rivière-Ouelle, are turning 350. Sainte-Hélène de Kamouraska and Sainte-Anne de la Pocatière, 175. Sainte-Pamphile, 150. And Saint-Joseph de Kamouraska, 100 years old. In the coming weeks, I will visit them and bring them a souvenir package and pay tribute to all the citizens of these municipalities, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Hull-Elmer. Mr. Speaker, Canada's women's hockey team won a gold medal. But I'd like to talk about young sports people here in the Outaouais region. The Intrepid team is made up of 17 of our best players and has qualified for Quebec's international Pee-wee tournament. To get that prestigious invitation, the team had to be ranked among the 14 best teams in the elite hockey team of Quebec, League of Quebec, rather. This team confronted the challenge, and all of the players are very proud to represent the Outaouais region at the tournament in May. The excellence of the Olympic team is something that inspires all Canadians. But ultimately, their victory represents years of hard work. It's not just a coincidence. The Intrepid are already on the right path. Go, Intrepid, go.
Member for Hamilton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, for 3 weeks, the city of Ottawa and border crossings across the country have been under siege by blockades and occupations. People in Ottawa have been criminally harassed, assaulted, and are afraid to leave their homes. The declaration of a public order emergency is the result of the failure of all levels of government failing to keep the public safe. Canadians are rightly concerned about these unprecedented measures being enacted and about the precedent it will set. I am too. It will be critical over the course of the debate over these next few days for the government to clearly explain why they believe the conditions to enact this emergency order have been met. There is no time for talking points, spin, or partisan attacks. Canadians deserve honest answers, accurate information, and clear reasoning. Conversely, the opposition has an important role to hold the government to account, to ask serious questions, and refrain from overheated rhetoric. Mr. Speaker, today marks an important moment in our history, and there will be much work to do in these weeks, months, and years to come. We must work to rebuild trust in our institutions, and that work must begin now.
L'honorable député de Manicouagan.
The honourable member for Manicouagan.
Monsieur le Président, il me fait grand plaisir de...
Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased today to state that the island of Anticosti has become a candidate to UNESCO's World Heritage Site list. The island is a jewel of the North Coast, Quebec, and the world. It is magnificent and unique. It has natural wealth, but also a very welcoming population. This historical announcement is celebrated by the population of the island. It is the result of a great deal of work. Mr. Speaker, from the very beginnings of the project, and right up until this announcement, I worked closely with elected officials, organizations, and people, and I supported the project every time that they needed me. I will continue to do so until Anticosti is celebrated as it deserves throughout the world. Together, we will succeed. Congratulations to everyone who lives on the island. You show that ambition and hard work can lead to major achievements. You show that by working together, we are capable of getting onto the UNESCO World Heritage List. Thank you.
The honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Mr. Speaker, we are debating an Emergencies Act because of a political crisis of the Prime Minister's own making. A political crisis here in Ottawa because of his failure to act sooner. But there is another crisis building across our country that he and his government have failed to act on. Canadians are seeing the rising cost of living impacting them in their homes, in their backyards, in my riding of North Okanagan, Shuswap, and across the country. Groceries will cost families $1,000 more this year. Energy prices have reached record levels, and rent rates are skyrocketing. Constituents have contacted me concerned about house prices going up 35 to 45%, concerned that young families can't afford their own homes. Seniors on fixed incomes cannot keep up with the inflation now pegged at 5.1%, the highest rate in 30 years. The Prime Minister and his government have failed to act on the cost of living crisis and have now created another crisis as a diversion. This is shameful. Canadians deserve better.
The honourable member for Ottawa Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. I rise in the House to honour my late friend Richard Patton, who dutifully served our community of Ottawa Centre as the Member of Provincial Parliament from 1987 to 1990 and from 1995 to 2007. During this time, he also served as Minister of Government Services and Minister of Correctional Services in Ontario. Speaker, after he retired from politics and as I succeeded him as the MPP, Richard gave me a note which read, "Remember, all of this belongs to the people." This sentiment captures the essence of Richard's brand of public service. He was your neighbor who was also your elected representative. Whether it was helping to save Ottawa's Aberdeen Pavilion, successfully fighting to keep Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario's heart surgery unit in Ottawa, or championing legislation to help people with severe mental illness, Richard Patton's legacy in Ottawa Centre will be felt forever. Speaker, as Richard bravely fought cancer, he never missed a day at the legislature or stepped away from many of his community-building activities. He died on December 30th of last year. Thank you to his wife, Penny, for sharing Richard with our community. Richard, Ottawa Centre will forever be a better place because of you. Thank you.
Oral questions, question orale, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, as a Canadian today, I'm disappointed. This morning, the Prime Minister finally deigned to speak to the House of Commons about his decision to run roughshod over Canadian democracy by invoking the Emergencies Act all across Canada. He had a unique opportunity to justify his resorting to this extreme legislation to solve the crisis that he himself created. He failed. He failed to show that this legislation was necessary in the circumstances. But my question is, why is this government using such radical legislation just to protect the Prime Minister's own leadership? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this siege and the blockades are causing significant damage to our economy. The international community needs to see Canada as a safe place to invest and do business. The obstruction of the Ambassador Bridge interrupted trade worth $390 million a day. Those costs are real. They threaten both big and small businesses, and that is why we must take action. The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, I think the finance minister should update her talking points. There is no longer any blockade in Windsor. That's over. We don't need the Emergencies Act there. It has been repeatedly said in the media that foreign groups are supporting the demonstrators in Ottawa, and an intelligence expert stated that there was no evidence to support that allegation, not even any suspicious transactions. Why? To justify, is the Prime Minister basing his decision on facts that don't even exist according to his own experts? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, business leaders in Canada know that these illegal blockades cannot go on, and they supported the necessary action our government has taken. Goldie Heyer, president of the Canada Business Council, said this week, we salute this decision as a step towards bringing the illegal blockades to an end all across the country and respect for the rule of law. That's precisely what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, I would repeat to her, there are no longer any blockades at the borders. Those have been resolved without the Emergencies Act. That's the reality. The Emergencies Act is a first. This is the first time it's been invoked. The War Measures Act was only used 3 times for the World War I, World War II, and the October crisis. Last week, the Prime Minister said there was no need for further measures, and then all of a sudden on Monday, he invoked the Emergencies Act. Bang. Can the government say what happened between Friday and Monday for the Prime Minister to flip-flop in such a short period of time? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as we did during the NAFTA negotiations, our government will always do what is needed to protect our workers and the national interest. We defended Canada during the NAFTA negotiations, and now we're defending Canada, defending Canadians against these illegal blockades and occupation. That's what we must do, and that is what we will keep doing.
Surrey, White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and the Emergency Preparedness Minister have repeatedly stated that foreign extremist financing is behind Canadian protests. At Public Safety Committee last week, Deputy Director of Intelligence for FinTrack, Barry McKillop, stated that there is no evidence to back up these claims. In fact, he stated, quote, there has not been a spike in suspicious transactions related to the protest, end quote. Why is the Prime Minister offside with Canada's national security experts?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I spoke yesterday with the head of FinTrack, and we are in close touch with that very important organization. The reality, her deputy, the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that FinTrack lacked the necessary authorities to oversee the new world of cryptocurrency and crowdsourcing and payment platforms. With these measures, Mr. Speaker, we have enhanced the authorities of FinTrack, and that is allowing us to stop the illegal funding of these illegal blockades.
The member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Mr. Speaker, this morning the Prime Minister contradicted two of his ministers who had stated that the application of the Emergency Measures Act would be geographically located. The PM said it would apply to all of Canada. All the border crossings in BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario have been cleared. The majority of premiers clearly say this government overreach is interfering in their jurisdictions. When will the Prime Minister revoke this reckless decision and begin rebuilding the trust of Canadians?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, once upon a time, the Conservative Party was a responsible party that believed in defending the national economic interest. I know one Conservative minister who served in such a government, Perrin Beattie, who created the Emergencies Act. Mr. Beattie said this week that when he brought in the Emergencies Act, he knew that there would inevitably be future crises. I spoke to Mr. Beattie today, and I told him about the work our government is doing to defend the Canadian economy.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, arresting participants in an illegal demonstration, you don't need the Emergencies Act for that. Cutting off social funding for an illegal activity, you don't need the Emergencies Act for that either. You don't need fines. Protecting strategic infrastructure doesn't need it either. For 21 days, the means to address this crisis have been there, but for 21 days, they haven't been used. Does the government realize that all that's been missing for the past 21 days is not the Emergencies Act, it's the government's leadership? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, business leaders from Quebec know that these illegal blockades cannot go on, and they have supported our government's action. The president of the Manufacturers and Exporters of Quebec said this week that manufacturers commend all action that will bring an end to blockages at our borders and restore Canada's reputation as a reliable trading partner. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, it's no joke. It's gotten to the point that the SQ are here in Ottawa to save this government's skin. No one needed the Emergencies Act to resolve the blockades in Alberta, Manitoba, and BC. It wasn't needed to clear the Ambassador Bridge. The problem is that the core of this crisis is parked out front of the federal parliament. And why? Because the federal government has been in hiding for 3 weeks. Don't they realize that the situation would be less dangerous today if they had taken responsibility in the first place? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we did take responsibility. We are taking responsibility. And I really would ask all members to be responsible, to act responsibly, elected them, and take responsibility for democracy in Canada, to protect the national interest. That is what we're doing, and that is what we will keep doing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The story of this pandemic has been a story of solidarity, of Canadians taking care of one another. But Canadians are now wondering what the plan is to get out of this pandemic. We know that the plan to get out of this pandemic has to include a science-based approach, and it has to include an approach to invest in our healthcare system. So will the Prime Minister commit to making sure our healthcare system is never again in the fear of collapsing, and that
Here, Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our country is moving past this pandemic thanks to the hard work, thanks to the common sense of Canadians, thanks to the fact that 90% of Canadians are vaccinated, thanks to the heroism of our healthcare workers and our essential workers. For that reason, Mr. Speaker, Canada has one of the best outcomes in the Western world when it comes to mortality rates. Had we had the U.S. level of mortality, Mr. Speaker, an additional 66,000 Canadians would have died. We are getting past the pandemic thanks to Canadians.
The honourable member for Burnaby South. The history of this pandemic